on the floor of the Senate, of the House, in conference committee, and we're going to change the debt course of this nation because the American people are going to demand it. I thank the chair and would yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senior senator from Minnesota is recognized.
Mr. President, I ask that the quorum call be dispensed with.
We're not in quorum.
Okay. Mr. President, it's been nearly 3 years since gas prices were as high as they are now. Back in July 2008, they peaked at about $4 per gallon. We're approaching $4 per gallon for gas today. The average price in Minnesota is $3.94 per gallon today, and the peak driving season is right around the corner. Back in 2008, I heard from many Minnesotans, from seniors who couldn't afford to drive to their pharmacies to pick up their prescription drugs, from workers who couldn't afford to drive to work, from middle-class moms and dads who had to cancel their summer vacations because they couldn't go up north because gasoline was just too high on their budgets. And although it wasn't the only factor, these high fuel prices 3 years ago helped to push our economy into a deep recession. We don't want that to happen again. One of the things we learned 3 years ago is that rising oil prices were not simply the result of supply and demand market factors. In fact, the dramatic run-up in gas prices was due in part to rampant price speculation by people who really had no business being in the oil market. These were not airlines or trucking companies or other businesses that actually need and use oil and gas and who trade in futures in order to protect their businesses against volatility in the oil market. No, Mr. President, the most frenzied price speculation was by Wall Street traders and hedge fund managers who would never actually touch a drop of oil. They'd never use it in their businesses. To them, it was just numbers on a computer screen. They were trying to game the system to make some quick profits and then take the money and run, all at the expense of those people in Minnesota or Ohio who are standing there at the gas pump watching those numbers add up. It is interesting if you take a look at the gas prices in Minnesota back in 2008. You can, in fact, find it on minnesotagasprices.com. Between July and the end of the year, prices went from $4 and dropped to $1.60 per gallon. Numerous experts have concluded that underlying supply and demand fundamentals can't account for the sharp rise or decline in prices. For example, in the first 6 months of 2008, U.S. economic output was declining while global supply was increasing. But when you look at the cost of oil during that time, it just doesn't match up. In June of 2007, oil cost $65 per barrel. A year later, in June of 2008, it reached $147 per barrel. It was down to $30 in December of 2008 and back up to $72 in June of 2009. Even if supply and demand were over the long run pushing the price of oil up, that alone couldn't explain the massive volatility in the market. Looking back, we now know that much of the dramatic decline in oil prices was the result of Wall Street speculators fleeing the oil market because the spotlight had finally been put on them. In other words, the heat was on and it got too hot for them to stay. But here we are today, Mr. President, 3 years later. Today, the price of a gallon of gas is nearly $1 higher than it was 10 months ago. And once again, I'm hearing from Minnesotans who are being squeezed by high prices, families, farmers, and businesses, large and small. There's no doubt that some of these prices can be attributed to reduced production from countries like Libya and Egypt. There's no doubt that we can increase domestic production of oil, whether in North Dakota, our neighboring state, where they literally have doubled their production of oil over the last few years, or in Louisiana. But increased domestic production takes time, and in any case, the impact on prices would not necessarily change things, nowhere near what we're seeing right now due to speculation. That's why a few months ago I wrote to Commodity Futures Trading Commission Chairman Gary Gensler urging him to make swift and strong implementation of speculation limits that were included in the Wall Street reform legislation that we passed last year. This legislation authorizes the Commission to impose limits on the size of speculative positions in oil futures markets by investors who are not bona fide oil traders. These position limits are designed to limit market manipulation and make sure that the oil market is operating fairly according to supply and demand. We don't want to see Wall Street speculators further drive up oil prices in the coming months. But, Mr. President, we also know that short-term solutions will only go so far. That's why I've been focused on a long-term energy strategy, a strategy that will provide incentives for our innovators, investors, and entrepreneurs to invest in solutions for our energy future. In 2008, I helped push the Commerce Committee through with a number of my colleagues the first update to our fuel economy standard in decades. These rules, which are now in place, are expected to save 1.8 billion barrels of oil, about 3 times as much as Libya produces every year. I'm also continuing to work on policies that will increase our homegrown energy production. And it's important to note, Mr. President, that studies suggest that biofuels can provide relief at the pump. A recent study from the University of Iowa indicates that from 2000 to 2010, competition from ethanol reduced wholesale gasoline prices by an average of 25 cents per gallon, saving American consumers an average of $34.5 billion each year. During the gasoline price run-up in 2010, the impact of ethanol on gasoline prices was substantially larger, reducing gasoline prices by a national average of 89 cents per gallon and by $1.37 per gallon in the Midwest. Biofuels are the largest and best alternative to imported oil. In fact, we produce more biofuels in this country than we import gasoline from Canada, our largest source of foreign imports. That's why in March, Mr. President, I introduced new legislation with Senator Tim Johnson that would significantly boost our nation's biofuels production and biofuels infrastructure while also providing long-term standards for increasing renewable energy production and major energy efficiency improvements. First, our bill would provide consumers with more choices at the gas pump by expanding biofuels infrastructure and increase alternative fuel vehicles. Specifically, it would expand the availability of blender pumps that are capable of dispensing different blends of ethanol and gasoline. It would provide loan guarantees to build new biofuels pipelines and would also require half of the cars produced in 2015 to be flex fuel vehicles, natural gas-powered, electric-powered, or hybrid vehicles. Second, to help offset costs, the bill would phase down and eventually phase out the ethanol tax credit. This credit is serving its purpose of helping reduce the price of gasoline and reduce our dependence on foreign oil by providing consumers a choice at the gas pump. But it won't be necessary forever. Last, the bill would create the first national standards for renewable energy and energy efficiency along the lines of Minnesota's 25% by 2025 standard and a 1% annual improvement in efficiency. If I could note, Mr. President, our state has an unemployment rate is significantly below the national average, 2 points below the national average. A lot of that has to do with our farm economy. A lot of it has to do with our innovative companies. But we have done it all with a renewable standard in place, 25% by 2025. We've done it all with a significant push on ethanol and biofuels and wind and solar. So I say that this can be a model for the rest of the country, Mr. President. Mr. President, our nation as a whole has an unemployment rate of 8.8%. Gas prices are approaching record levels. We continue to send $730 million a day to foreign countries, many of which have been known to funnel money to terrorists to meet our basic fuel needs. That's $730 million a day for fuel that we send to other countries. I think we should be investing in the farmers and the workers of the Midwest instead of the oil cartels of the Mideast. Whether it is biofuels plants in the Midwest, whether it is electric car factories across this country, whether it is electric car battery factories in your home state of Ohio, Mr. President, that is the future. It is not continuing to send millions of dollars a day to the Mideast. Each of the provisions in this bill have some support from both Republicans and Democrats. And I am hopeful, Mr. President, that the bipartisan spirit of this bill can help advance a serious bipartisan discussion about thoughtful solutions to rising gas prices. The key is that everyone needs to realize that inaction is not an option, that bumper sticker slogans will only result in our kicking the can down the road. This is about putting some sensible limits on speculation that doesn't affect legitimate companies that are legitimately hedging their risk. This is about a comprehensive energy plan for the future that includes that drilling in North Dakota and other parts of the country, but also includes natural gas, also includes hydro, also includes geothermal, also includes wind and solar and biofuels. That's what this is about. And if we learned anything from Japan, and while I support nuclear energy in this country, and I think that should be in the mix as well, is that you don't want to rely too much on one source of energy. And this idea that we're looking regionally, that we're looking across the country at different sources of energy is key as we go forward. During these challenging economic times, we can no longer just put our heads in the sand and pretend this isn't happening. Just talk to anyone that's filling up their car at the pump right now. Talk to anyone that wants to go up to their cabin in northern Minnesota for the summer every weekend. They'll tell you that it does matter. Now is the time to act. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor. Mr. President, I have 10 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and the minority leaders. I ask unanimous consent that these requests be agreed to and that these requests be printed in the record.
Without objection. So ordered.
Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from South Dakota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, at some time in the not-too-distant future, some speculation about exactly when, our country will be dealing with the issue of exceeding our borrowing authority. In other words, Mr. President, we have maxed out our credit card. That would be the equivalent for the average family when you can't borrow any more money. And so what happens in that event is the Congress has to take action. The Congress essentially has to raise the country's borrowing authority. It's called raising the debt limit. Well, we're coming up on that point in time. It could happen sometime in the July-August time frame. There's some uncertainty as exactly when that happens. But the point is, Mr. President, it will happen. And the reason it will happen is because we have now accumulated $14.3 trillion in debt. And we've hit the limit, the cap, that exists today on our borrowing authority. Now, $14.3 trillion in the abstract is hard for most people to wrap their heads around because it is such a massive, massive number. But if you translate it into an individual term, it amounts to about $46,000 for every single person in the United States, which in and of itself, Mr. President, is an astonishing amount. Our projected deficit this year is $1.425 trillion, which is the largest ever in nominal terms, and according to CBO, it is the second largest as a share of the economy literally since World War II. Now, that's as much debt as we ran up from our nation's founding, going back to the origin of this country up until 1984. That's the equivalent just in this one single year that we're going to rack up in terms of the deficit. The interest on that amounts to about $213 billion every single year, or nearly $700 for every person in the United States. And this is assuming that interest rates stay at these historically low levels. Now, while the deficit spending is, in fact, something that will merely delay taxes in the future, that somebody's going to have to pay. At some point, this is going to have to be paid off, and that burden, in all likelihood, is going to fall on our children and our grandchildren. But it's not just something, Mr. President, that we will have to deal with down the road. Because the implications today, the real-time implications of this level of spending and debt are very real for the economy. And there's a great body of research been done, a study done by economists Reinhardt and Rogoff found that countries with a debt-to-GDP ratio of more than 90% grew at 1 percentage point less than they would have otherwise. Now, that's a body of research that looks at nations over the last half-century, even goes further back than that, but particularly in the last half-century, and particularly developed nations, who have gotten up to that level of debt that exceeds 90% of GDP. Well, that's where we are today. We're at 93% debt to GDP here in the United States. So if you take that assumption that any time you reach that sort of a debt level and you sustain it over a long period of time, that it costs you a single percentage point of economic growth every single year, according to the President's own economic team, that results in the loss of about 1 million jobs. So if you think about the real-time implications of this level of spending and debt, it means that we're losing about 1 million jobs every single year in the economy. And so you can't say that this is something down the road, that we can continue to kick the can down the road. The fact of the matter, Mr. President, is we are running out of road. We keep kicking the can, but we are at the end of the road. If we don't take steps now, not only is it going to put a crushing burden of debt on future generations and jeopardize the very foundation of our economy, it is going to have real-time implications today, not just in the future. And so I would suggest, Mr. President, that as we look at this issue of the debt limit coming up, that it presents a unique opportunity. And I would hope that both sides, my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats, can come together, because if we don't bring this debt to GDP ratio back down, we're going to continue to suffer from these job losses. And the impacts really of that are very clear. When the government is out there borrowing more money, it crowds out private investment. There's less money for private companies and individuals to invest in companies, equipment, plants, housing, training, all those sorts of things. And it spends money on government, on things that are probably less efficient, less necessary, more duplicative, oftentimes downright wasteful when it comes to the programs and the projects that end up being funded. So it means that instead of investing in funding, having funding for new factories for people to work in, we've got more bureaucrats. We've got more bureaucrats at places like the EPA and the National Labor Relations Board, who are coming up with all kinds of new regulations that are making more difficult for our small businesses to create jobs. We have more unnecessary federal property being underutilized that the private sector could use more efficiently. Unfortunately, Mr. President, the risk to our economy that comes from this out-of-control spending is more than just that. It's more than just the crowding out of private sector investment and the stifling effects of government regulation. We're beginning to face the very real possibility that our country could face a fiscal crisis. Now, former Chairman Greenspan has suggested that the risk of this occurring in the next few years is nearly 50-50, an alarming thought. Likewise, the Standard & Poor's recently warned of a possible downgrade to the U.S. credit rating in the next 2 to 3 years. When they came out with their assessment of the U.S. credit and said that they attached a negative assessment to it, in most cases, at least a majority of the cases, within a year's time, that leads to a downgrade of the credit rating. That would be disastrous for a country like ours, which has always taken great pride and has been the sort of rock out there when it comes to a AAA credit rating. And it's notoriously, I think, difficult, Mr. President, to predict ultimately when a debt crisis might occur. But it would be inexcusable for us to continue to spend at these elevated levels without assuming that there's even the slightest hint of a risk that this could be very devastating to our country, let alone that that risk could be very high. But if it were to occur, you would need drastic spending cuts to drag ourselves out of this fiscal crisis, spending cuts that by today's standards would probably be unimaginable. But the worst effect of this deep recession would be the deep recession that it would throw our economy into. And just think about that for a minute, Mr. President, because if you did have a debt crisis in this country, what does that mean? What it means simply is that for most people it's going to mean higher interest rates. It's going to lead to countless job losses, pay cuts for a lot of people if you have job losses, and probably a significant loss of savings, which would take a terrible toll on the American people. Those are many of the implications of a debt crisis and the implications it would have on the economy, starting, as I said earlier, with higher interest rates. It would make it more difficult for people to borrow money for a home, for a car, for their business. All those sorts of things would be impacted. But it doesn't have to be the case. And the reason it doesn't is because most experts have suggested, and it's really true, that this is the most predictable economic crisis that we've ever had. It's not like we don't see it coming. You see all the warning signs out there. You see all the red flags out there. And it's looking us right in the face. And we have an opportunity to do something about it. but it will require that we have the political courage to take on this issue of federal spending. Next week, we're going to have an opportunity in the Budget Committee to mark up the 2012 budget, which, incidentally, the budget year starts in a mere 5 months from now. Now, I would hope that this budget will focus primarily on cutting spending, because I think that's the primary driver of our deficits. I am concerned that instead it will merely continue to spend too much, borrow too much, and tax too much. Now, of course, last year, even though there was a markup in the Budget Committee, there was never a budget brought to the floor of the United States Senate. The Congress never passed a budget, nor was there one brought to the floor of the House of Representatives. There wasn't even a vote on a budget in the House or the Senate last year. We have a $3.8 trillion enterprise called the federal government that didn't even pass a budget. I mean, the most fundamental responsibility, I believe, that we have to the taxpayers of this country is to come up with a plan about how we are going to responsibly use their tax dollars, to indicate to them that they can expect a good return on those tax dollars by the way that we do our budget. Well, frankly, Mr. President, that didn't happen last year, and I certainly hope that this year it does. But it's going to take some leadership here in the Congress. Now, in the House of Representatives, the Republicans have the majority. They did pass a budget out of the House. I hope that the Senate Democrats here will also put a budget on the floor that we will be able to vote on and amend and have a meaningful discussion about spending and debt and what we're going to do to get this country back on a path of fiscal sustainability. Now, the President I think you could argue, punted when it comes to the issue of spending and debt, first by saying, okay, I'm going to appoint a commission to look at this issue. So the commission studied it for several months, came out with some findings and ultimately a report in which they put forward a series of recommendations for dealing with the fiscal crisis. The President sort of distanced himself from those recommendations, chose not to take those things and to really engage with that commission and their recommendations, and then subsequent to that submitted a budget this year which ironically didn't do anything to address the long-term issues of spending and debt, rather increased spending over the next decade, massively increased the debt, and increased a lot of taxes on small businesses in this country who are job creators. And so you did have this issue of borrowing, spending, and debt continually being advanced and put forward by this President and by many of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle here in the Congress. And so the House Republicans put out a proposal that's been criticized by some, but at least, Mr. President, they have put forward a plan. They have engaged the issue of what we're going to do to rein in out-of-control spending, both in the near term, but also in the longer term with the entitlement program, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, which represent 60% of all federal spending. If we don't rein those programs in or come up with a way of reforming those programs so that they are viable, when the 80 million baby boomers retire, we are headed for a train wreck. It is inevitable. You cannot, with the numbers that are facing us, and the kinds of deficits that we're already running, the amount of debt that we've already accumulated, in any way assume that we can get out of this crisis absent taking on these issues and coming up with meaningful reforms for Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Now, whether or not you, again, subscribe to or like the proposals that were put forward by the House Republicans, there at least is a plan out there. Now, there are a number of things being bandied around here in the United States Senate. There's a gang of 6 that's looking at some recommendations. As I said, there's going to be a markup, we think, next week in the Senate Budget Committee. There's now this new commission that the President has appointed to look at the issue of, as we approach the vote on the debt limit, and looking at the issue of what we can do to address spending and debt. But frankly, Mr. President, we don't have at this point anything in front of us that does deal directly or meaningfully with this issue of out-of-control spending or debt. I hope that some of these discussions are fruitful, that they lead to results, that they at least put alternatives out there that we can debate and discuss. But as of right now, the only proposal we have in front of us is the one put forward by the House Republicans. And again, whether you like it or not, it at least it has created a discussion in this country about what we're going to do to fix our fiscal problems. Now, I believe that we ought to, at a minimum, go back to 2008 spending levels, because if you did that, you would take us back to a time before we had these massive run-ups or increases in discretionary spending. In the last 2 years, we've seen discretionary spending increase by well over 20% at a time when inflation in the overall economy was a mere 2%. And so federal spending was increasing literally at 10 times the rate of inflation over the past 2 years, Mr. President. It makes sense to me in this fiscal environment where your deficits are literally about $1.5 trillion every single year as far as the eye could see, that the least we could do is to restrain spending and cut it back to that level we were at in 2008 before we had this massive run-up in spending. And so I think that's a starting point. I believe that we also ought to be looking at the entitlement programs, which, as I said, have trillions of dollars literally of unfunded liabilities. Medicare alone is a $38 trillion unfunded liability. We're currently on a path where that will bankrupt the nation if we don't make changes there. And it strikes me, at least, that you've got to have not only some issues that deal with the short-term near-term spending issues, but those longer-term spending issues. And in the near term, as I said, if you went back to 2008 levels, you would at least tighten our belts a little bit in a way that I think most Americans would find to be responsible. But the longer-term issue, these entitlement programs, have to be taken on. Now, there are a series of things that have been proposed that would deal with that, one of which is a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. That, frankly, is something I support. I have supported it since I was in the House of Representatives, been a co-sponsor of that. In fact, when I first got to Congress back in 1997, there was a vote here in the Senate on a balanced budget amendment, which failed by one vote. It takes 67 votes in the Senate, two-thirds of the Senate, to approve a balanced budget amendment. It failed by one vote. I assume at that time, had it passed in the Senate, we would have been able to pass it in the House of Representatives because we had large majorities, and we could have sent it on to the states, and 38 states, it takes 38 states to ratify it. But since most states already have balanced budget amendments in their Constitution, I suspect that they would like to see their federal government operate with the same sort of fiscal discipline. But it didn't pass at the time. I can't imagine how different our world would be today had it passed 15 years ago, and how different this fiscal picture might look, because it would have put a straitjacket on Washington, D.C., something that we desperately need. Congress needs a discipline imposed on it. It has not demonstrated historically the capacity to deal with these fiscal issues absent some sort of mechanism that puts a straitjacket on the Congress so that it can't spend money. The balanced budget amendment is something I think we ought to have a debate about, and I hope we do. And we get up, the lead up to this vote on the debt limit, this is one of many proposals that we hope to have considered. And as I said before, there are so many states around the country that have balanced budget amendments to their Constitution. Our state of South Dakota is a good example. In the state of South Dakota, the legislature can't go home until the budget is balanced. That simply is something that is a requirement. And many states across this country have that same sort of requirement. It is an imperative that requires these states to every single year put their books in order. And that is something that is desperately lacking here in Washington, D.C. And I hope, again, that we could enact a balanced budget amendment. There is one that's been proposed. There are several that have been proposed. And I'm a co-sponsor of a couple of different versions of that. But we have 47 Republicans that are on a balanced budget amendment. And I hope that our colleagues on the other side will join us in at least bringing that to a vote, putting it before the American people, and engaging them in a debate about how best to solve our nation's fiscal problems. And I think that they would agree that a balanced budget amendment is a very simple, straightforward way in which to do that. I also believe, Mr. President, that we ought to reform our budget process because it's clearly broken. We have a dysfunctional budget process here when you can't pass a budget, when you've got a $3.8 trillion enterprise like the federal government, and you don't even pass a budget. And in most years, typically, you have, if there is a budget that passes, the appropriation bills that follow it are supposed to be completed by the end of the fiscal year on September 30th. Those deadlines routinely are missed. Typically, what happens here is we end up with a big so-called omnibus spending bill at the end of the year that wraps all the various appropriation bills into one massive spending bill, which I don't believe serves the taxpayers very well. it certainly doesn't allow us as members of Congress to do the appropriate oversight that we should do on various individual agencies of government. When you throw it all into one big spending bill, like so often happens around here, you lose the transparency and the accountability that is necessary to an effective functioning government. And so I believe that we ought to reform the budget process, and one of the ways I would do that is to go to a biannual budget. Instead of passing a budget every single year, we do it every other year. We do it in the odd-numbered years, the years when people are not running for re-election, because typically what happens in a year when people are running for re-election is that they decide the best way to gain the favor of the voters is to provide more money for this particular program or this constituency or that constituency, and as a consequence there is a momentum to spend more and more and more money. It strikes me that one of the ways that you could address that is you do a budget in the odd-numbered years when members of Congress are not running for re-election. And then in the even-numbered years, when they are, you look at ways that we not can spend money, but how can we save money. We do more oversight, which is something that is desperately lacking. Because many of these federal programs and agencies so oftentimes sort of do their own thing absent the appropriate level of oversight. And I believe we have a responsibility as members of the Congress with whom the legislative responsibility, the power of the purse is entrusted by the Constitution to do the right types of oversight. And a good example came across here recently when the Government Accountability Office came out with a report. And in that report, they referenced several different programs. In fact, they dealt with, I think, about a third of all federal spending. But in examining that one-third of federal spending, they concluded that there are all kinds of duplications and redundancies in federal spending. And I'll just give you a couple by way of example. They discovered that there are 82 programs spread across 20 different federal agencies that deal with the issue of teacher training, that are designed to focus on the issue of teacher training. Well, I suspect that it's arguable about whether that's something the federal government ought to be doing in the first place, but it is certainly, I think any American would agree, absolutely insane to have 82 different programs and 20 different agencies doing the same thing. Another thing that they discovered was that there are 56 federal programs that are focused on the issue of teaching financial literacy. And I've said this before, and I mean it sincerely, of all places, Washington, D.C. shouldn't be leading or doing instruction on financial literacy. But that being said, 56 programs spread across 10 different agencies. Do we really need that, Mr. President? And that's the kind of thing that gets lost. That's the duplication and inefficiency and waste that we all talk about. And yet, because we don't do the oversight that we need to, many of these things just continue year after year after year. Well, going to a biennial budget where every other year you do a budget, and then in the even-numbered years, the election years, you're doing oversight, you might actually think of ways to save the money for the taxpayers as opposed to spending it. And so a biennial budget, to me, makes sense. I would make the budget resolution that we pass here binding, because right now it's not. And as a consequence, it often gets waived. I believe that you need to have buy-in from the President. Right now, the budget resolution is passed by the House and the Senate, but the White House doesn't engage on that, and so you don't have teeth in this thing that hold everybody accountable when it comes to spending, and too often that gets waived. We need to change the way that we do things around here with regard to declaring emergencies. I mean, right now, if we want to spend money outside the parameters of the budget, everybody says, well, it's an emergency, and so declaring an emergency has become the norm rather than the exception. It's become the routine here in the Congress. We've got all these emergency designations which allow Congress to spend and spend and spend, and again, there aren't any constraints on that, Mr. President, and it is high time that we change that. So I'd make a number of changes in our budget process which I think would lead to more transparency, more accountability, a more efficient, better run federal government. But that being said, it is not the federal government that's going to lead us back to an economic recovery and getting people back to work. It is the hardworking entrepreneurs, it is the small businesses, it is the people in this country who roll up their sleeves every day and go to work to try and make this country stronger and more prosperous. We are blessed because we have a nation that was founded on some core principles, one of which is economic freedom. We believe in free enterprise and free markets. It is a system that has worked extraordinarily well for this country. You look anywhere else around the world and you have to try and find a rival to what the hardworking entrepreneurs in this country and those basic core economic principles have been able to accomplish. You can't find one. And it's because of that, those core principles and the incredible ingenuity, innovation, creativity, and hard work of the American people that we have the greatest economy in the world. But that economy, Mr. President, as I said, is very much in jeopardy if Washington doesn't get its spending habits under control, because we continue to crowd out private investment, we continue to make it harder for entrepreneurs to create jobs. And as we talk about the whole issue of spending and debt, one final point I'd like to make, because there's this discussion right now about whether or not there ought to be tax increases. And everybody says, well, you know, revenues are down relative to historical averages, and that's true. But one of the reasons I believe revenues are down is because there are literally trillions of dollars sitting on the sidelines in this country that aren't invested because of the economic uncertainty based upon policies coming out of Washington. Uncertainty about tax policy, uncertainty about regulations. You have this tax and regulatory environment that is paralyzing the American economy. And so businesses out there that have funds that they could deploy, capital that they could put to work in this country, aren't doing it because they are worried about what Washington might do next. We have tax policy that's going to expire at the end of 2012. It's very hard to make decisions when tax policies are temporary. It's very hard to make decisions when you don't know what that regulatory agency is going to do to you next. And they have consistently, these regulatory agencies, come up with more and more ideas about how to make it more costly, more expensive, more difficult to do business in this country. I've alluded to a couple. The EPA is a good case in point. It's one that comes into play a lot in my state of South Dakota because we're primarily an ag economy and small businesses, and many of those policies are directed at production agriculture and energy development and all those sorts of things that allow our economy in my state to grow and to prosper. And so I think one of the reasons that tax revenues are down, people aren't investing. And when they're not investing, they're not turning those resources over, they're not taking realizations, and they're not paying taxes. We need to get investment capital put to work in this country. We need to get people put back to work. And the best way to do that is to provide economic certainty, tax policies, regulatory policies that are reasonable and that provide incentives, not disincentives, for investment in this country. And today, we have tax and regulatory policies that are doing absolutely the opposite. They are discouraging investment, and as a consequence, I think we have a lower level of revenues. But the real problem, Mr. President, is not revenues, it is spending. And that's abundantly clear. If you look at where we have been for the last 40 years in terms of what we spend as a percentage of our overall economy, that average is about 20.6%. That's a 40-year average, historical average, we spend on our federal government as a percentage of our entire economy. This year, we will spend 25.3% of our entire economy on just the federal government. That doesn't include spending on state and local governments. When you add that up, it's over 40% of every dollar that we spend in this country is spent on government. And so what we see is the government is growing relative to our total economy, and the private economy, those folks out there that are creating the jobs in our private economy, is shrinking relative to the size of the government. And that's something, that is a trend, Mr. President, that we have got to reverse. It starts with getting spending under control here. This is not a revenue problem. This is not a tax problem. And as much as many of my colleagues would like to make it that, you flat can't look the facts in the face and come to any other conclusion but that spending here in Washington is under control. It has got to be reined in. We have got to attack the issue not only of discretionary spending, the part that we annually appropriate for, but these entitlement programs, which, if not addressed, are not only going to bankrupt the country, but ensure that there isn't a Medicare program and a Social Security program available to future generations of Americans. These are very tumultuous times in our country, Mr. President. There's a lot of uncertainty. You know, I think the jobs numbers that came out this morning again point to just how fragile this economic recovery is. And it is so dependent upon good, sound policies coming out of Washington, D.C. For better or worse, small businesses in this country, entrepreneurs in this country now, unfortunately, tend to be partners with Washington, D.C., because there is so much policy coming out of here, whether it's tax policy, regulatory policy, that impacts their bottom lines every single day. We need to get out of the way to keep those taxes low, to get federal spending under control, to make sure that the regulatory framework in which our businesses operate represents the minimum level and not the maximum level that we can do to make it more difficult for small businesses to grow and to create jobs. If we can do those types of things, address the issue of spending and debt, take it on in a meaningful way, deal with this issue of reforming our tax code and making sure that our tax rates stay low on businesses in this country, and make sure that regulations and regulatory policies coming out of Washington, D.C. Are not the impediment that they are today to investment and job creation. I think we can get this country back on track. But that's where it starts. And if we want to create jobs, if we want to grow this economy, if we want to make it more prosperous and stronger for future generations, those are the steps, in my view, that we have to take. I hope we get started soon. And I don't think we can afford to wait. A lot of people around here think that this is just, these are all political exercises that, you know, let's just, we'll go through the hoops and the motions and you know, we'll wait to solve this until after the next election. We cannot afford to wait. The time is now. If we don't do it, we are going to put in great peril future generations and their ability to enjoy the same standard of living, the same quality of life that we've enjoyed. And that is not fair to them, Madam President, and that's why I believe the time to start is now, and the time to get this budget process, not only the reforms of the process, but the spending restraints in place is today. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Ohio.
Thank you, Madam President. I was presiding before the senior senator from Missouri took my place, and listening to two of the last three speakers talk about their budget religion, if you will. And I think about this, and I think you've got to look at a little bit of history. And I don't think that I need a lecture on balancing your budget. I was in the House of Representatives in the 1990s when, without one Republican vote, we passed President Clinton's budget. We had a huge budget deficit in those days. That budget began us on a path to a balanced budget. I supported a balanced budget amendment in the mid-1990s. By 2000, the year that President Clinton left office, we had the biggest budget surplus in American history. And then, in 2001, at the push of President Bush and his Republican colleagues in both houses, this Congress passed a major tax cut, mostly for the wealthy, in 2001, another major tax cut, mostly for the wealthy, in 2003, both of which I voted against. President Bush, with intelligence that was not especially sound, being gentle about it, took us into a war with Iraq, didn't pay for it, took us into a war with Afghanistan, didn't pay for it. I voted against the war in Iraq. But in 2003 or 4, pushed through Congress by one vote. I remember I was in the House of Representatives opposing that bill when they kept the roll call open for 2 hours or longer that night. President Bush was on the phone with recalcitrant members of his party in the House of Representatives, pushed through a Medicare bill that was a bailout to the drug and insurance companies in the name of Medicare privatization without paying for it. President Bush leaves office then, leaving the largest budget deficit in American history, going from the largest budget surplus, written by and large by the Democrats, because the Republicans didn't play ball with us during most of the 1990s. Then, after President Bush and total Republican leadership in many of those years, House, Senate, President Bush, left us with the biggest budget deficit in history. So when I hear this revisionist history on the Senate floor, I was not even going to talk about this today, but I heard two colleagues whom I have respect for, one from Alabama, one from South Dakota, talk about this budget deficit in a way that simply is historically inaccurate. In the name of this deficit, and we have to deal with this deficit. I know that the presiding officer is focused on that. A lot of us are focused on we have to deal with this deficit. But you don't do the same thing over again, where you give big tax cuts to the wealthiest Americans and then privatize Medicare. That's what they're doing. They're cutting health care. They're cutting health care, saying it's not sustainable, whatever that means, and giving major tax cuts for the rich, never saying that's not sustainable. Madam President, I would like to separate my previous remarks with the rest of my remarks in the congressional record, if I could, Madam President.
Without objection.
Thank you. I want to talk about teachers. In my state, the legislature just passed something called SB 5. The governor of Ohio signed it. It was a direct assault in many ways on the teaching profession. The discussions I hear from conservative politicians and their allies in the discussions I hear from conservative politicians and their allies in the media, and they have many on editorial boards, especially in Central Ohio, discussions of the lack of respect they show for people who chose to teach as a profession is just mind-boggling. We trust our children to teachers, yet we attack them, or too many politicians attack them. I'm going to make it personal. I'm going to start with my mom. My mom was a high school English teacher. She was born in Mansfield, Georgia in 1920. She taught in the era of segregation in Florida and Georgia. Raising my two older brothers and me in Mansfield, Ohio, she met my dad coming back from World War II and moved to another Mansfield in the north, Mansfield, Ohio. They met in Washington at the end of the war. She taught in an era of a growing American middle class. Like teachers throughout our history, she taught her students and her sons that education is a gateway to opportunity that can integrate a segregated nation and can create a prosperous nation. At a time when our nation needs our teachers the most, when our economy needs our students to succeed, it's appropriate that we remind ourselves, in spite of this background noise that I hear from so many conservative politicians about teachers' unions and about teachers that don't care and about teachers taking off in the summer and teachers are done at 3 o'clock and all the kinds of attacks they like to make on teachers. I think it's important to remind ourselves the importance of our teachers. This week, our country recognizes National Teacher Appreciation Week to give thanks and gratitude to those people across the country to whom we entrust our children who have made a difference in our lives. Let me share a few stories of great teachers in Ohio. Linda Michael of Pomeroy, Ohio, in Meigs County down on the Ohio River. Ms. Michael works with homeless students K through 12 to make sure they have equal access to the same education as other students, from Head Start to preschool to doctor referrals. She locates students in shelters and motels and homes of relatives to make sure they have what they need: housing assistance, clothing, food, utilities, mental health. I mean, this is a teacher that quits at 3 o'clock, that doesn't work in the summers, this is above and beyond the call of duty that most of us most of us do in our society. I mean, imagine growing up homeless, going to school, not having your own room, not having a room to share with your sibling, not having a place to go at night. And we need teachers to take care of them. We need to do better as a society, but teachers are really the safety net for these children in Meigs County. Ms. Michelle Residio Rupright is an elementary school teacher in Cleveland. For her, teaching is not a 9-to-5 job. It means going to homeless shelters after school where her students live. It means buying supplies for students in the classroom out of her pocket. She's a role model to the community. How many teachers, and I know Senator McCaskill talks to teachers a lot and hears these, how many teachers tell us that they reach into their pockets? Now, these aren't Wall Street bankers. These are teachers. They're making sometimes as little as $35,000, $40,000, $45,000, $50,000 a year. How many of them reach into their pockets? Do senators reach into our pockets and buy folders for our office or buy pens? I mean, do senators do that? Do most business people like that reach into their pockets to take care of their children? So many teachers do. To buy construction paper, they teach grade school. To buy pens, to give kids money for lunch sometimes. Clearly, teachers play a role that most people in this country don't play. David Fawcett, a Columbus drama teacher. Mr. Fawcett's helped generations of new immigrants and low-income students see something greater in themselves, more than just a poor immigrant child trying to make it. He encourages students to learn language and speech and culture through lines of a play or a musical, through elocution lessons and his guiding presence. Again, another teacher that focuses on the individual unique needs of a child that may have been born in another country, may have parents that don't speak English coming here. That child has some different challenges from what I had with educated English-speaking as a native language parents in Mansfield, Ohio, with lots of ideas and privileges. I was taught by my parents to read before I started kindergarten because I was smarter than other kids, because I had parents that knew that mattered for me to get ahead and for the advantages I'd have. Mr. Fawcett clearly focuses on each child's individual unique personality, needs, situation, all that. John Keller, a government teacher in Orange. Orange is a suburb about 20 miles east of Cleveland, 15 miles east of Cleveland. Mr. Keller addresses the complexity of a subject with the simplest tools, a sense of humor. He engages students as soon as they walk in the classroom, ensuring a passionate debate, empowering students to stand up, to speak out, to learn about the world around them. He makes them laugh. What better way to teach than engaging in students and having a big personality and making people laugh, and sometimes the teacher himself, I'm sure, being the butt of the jokes, the humor about himself. Ms. Deb Lammers and Mr. Paul Lenz, teachers in Miller City and Putnam County, Ohio, southwest of one of Ohio's smallest counties, southwest of Toledo. They are the kind of math teachers every student deserves. They are patient and kind. They adapt teaching skills to student needs. They arrive early. They stay late. Again, all this stuff. Oh, teachers quit at 3 o'clock. Teachers don't work in the summer. All this kind of thing that conservatives, why they don't like teachers, beyond me, but why so many conservative politicians attack teachers for all kinds of things, I don't even pretend to understand. But Ms. Lammers, Mr. Lenz, teaching in Putnam County, Ohio, arrive early, stay late, be accessible to students whenever they need help. Ms. Dillette Walker is a retired grade school teacher in Shaker Heights, another Cleveland suburb. For decades, she helped children overcome the insecurity of shyness, instilling them the confidence to read out loud, to sing in a musical, to confront their fears. We know how young children, I have 4, my wife and I do, and when they were young, they're not so shy now. When they were young, they were fairly shy, and they had teachers that helped bring them out of their shells sometimes. And as parents, we try to do that, and with some success, but teachers I've watched teachers with my own children, watched them with Emily and Elizabeth, watched them, help them believe in themselves, particularly young girls. I wanted to teach my daughters that they could accomplish anything, and the fact that they're of their gender, especially in that generation, a few years ago, that particularly when I was a kid, that you know, girls were treated differently, and girls were not expected to achieve the way boys did in too many cases, or the way boys were expected to. And I saw teachers with my own daughters help them believe in themselves in a big, important way. And that's what Mrs. Walker did, now retired, but with grade school children that she taught in Shaker Heights. Diane Skelly, Vicki Hilliard, Pat Carson, high school teachers in West Carrollton, Ohio, outside of Dayton. Through the written word, chemistry equations, musicals, they're teachers who encourage students to try harder, to reach higher, never to doubt one's talents. And I know that a young woman in my office was taught by these 3 teachers, and I know that she believes she can. I know her parents too, and I know she believes that she can take on the world and grow and learn something that women, maybe a generation or 2, might not have been so successful at. And Ms. Skelly, Vicki Hilliard, Pat Carson, all 3 of them in West Carrollton helped her achieve that, and helped countless others in Montgomery County and that part of southwest Ohio to believe in themselves and move forward, whether it was in English, whether it was music, whether it was chemistry. Vicki Speakman was a Grandview high school teacher. Grandview is outside of Columbus. Spanish teacher, dedicated mother, a bedrock of the community. Diagnosed with cancer, Mrs. Speakman remained a constant presence at games and concerts, never missing a chance to share a smile, tell a joke, reach out to a lonely student. 10 years ago next month, Ms. Speakman lost her fight with cancer, but like all great teachers, her memory lives in the countless students whose lives are better because of her. Not just her memory, but the impact she had on these students, whether they think of Ms. Speakman every day or every week, they live a life differently because of Ms. Speakman, and that's true with so many of these teachers. That, and when I think of this teacher, and I did not know Ms. Speakman, but when I think of her presence at ball games and school plays, and I think of so many teachers I had at Mansfield Senior High School. The name of my junior high was one that will probably make the pages sitting here laugh. The name of my junior high was Johnny Appleseed Junior High School in north central Ohio, where Johnny Appleseed, 200 years ago or so, used to go around. It was a peculiar life he lived. He went around in a country that was totally forested, planting apple trees, but to each his own, but he became a legend as a result. But I just remember at Brinkerhoff Grade School, at Johnny Appleseed Junior High School, Mansfield Senior High School, I remember so many teachers that would come to our plays. I played basketball in 8th grade and played baseball and basketball in high school. I'd see teachers, not just the coaches, but teachers come to the games, the Friday night basketball games or the Tuesday afternoon baseball games or the school plays on Saturday. part of the community, cheering on their students, not showing favorites, but caring particularly for those students that were a little shy or a little less talented that might need a bump up from their teacher and encouragement from their teacher. The same goes for Miss Jackie Geary, who taught reading for 45 years in Dayton. She was a matriarch of a family of educators. Her husband, Mike, is a professor at the University of Dayton, one of our great universities in Ohio. Her daughter, Beth, is a special needs teacher for families of U.S. military personnel in the country of Japan. Aside from her constant smile and laugh, she reminded all who knew her that one of her great responsibilities is to read to a child each and every night. Jackie passed away last month after a long battle with cancer. Up until her very last day, she insisted on teaching the most valuable lesson of all, compassion and love and commitment. Again, teachers who go above and beyond the call of duty, not just to collect a paycheck, not to go home at 3, not just be off in the summer and not be part of the community. Ms. Geary, as Ms. Speakman, gave so much of their lives to their students. Both passed away, have passed away. Ms. Speakman some time ago, Ms. Geary more recently. Both will be remembered and their impact will be seen throughout. Sandy Ryan is a special ed preschool teacher in Cleveland. She first taught special needs adults. She went to college later in life to earn a master's degree to teach special needs children. She buys her students coats in the winter, supplies, book bags, and books for children who can't afford them. Again, we don't pay teachers a lot. They're barely in the middle class in terms of their income if they're a single parent and on a teacher's salary, yet again, they reach into their pockets. This isn't just buying pencils and pens and occasional lunch money. This is a teacher who buys coats in the winter sometimes for her students because she teaches in a low-income area. Ms. Donna Marie Scher is a high school teacher in Oberlin. She partners with local and international projects, water projects in the community, to building homes in Jamaica, to schools in Pakistan and Afghanistan. She inspires students to believe education is continuous and service is a lifelong pursuit that extends beyond the classroom. A teacher who, by showing by example, teaching by example, helps these students navigate the rest of their lives. A commitment to service beyond the classroom, beyond their workday, beyond their family, a commitment to service in the community, and it doesn't stop at our borders. With Ms. Scher from Oberlin, not far from where I live, it's international also. Ms. Dean Blaze, an English teacher at Clark Montessori School in the city of Cincinnati. I visited Clark last year. It was a finalist for the competition for President Obama to deliver its commencement speech, losing out at the last minute to a school in Michigan. Teachers like Ms. Blaze instill values of curiosity and wonder in her students from diverse backgrounds, encouraging academic achievement and community service. Teachers are counselors, they're coaches, they're mentors, they serve as surrogate parents, they're friends of students at the right time, they're advisors, they're cheerleaders, they're partners, they're fill in the blank that any of us can do because we've had good teachers in our lives. They so often go the extra step. They drive talented pupils to competitions and scholarship interviews. They are a central part of our communities. Yet, Madam President, in Ohio, SB 5 is an amazing thing. It basically takes away rights from teachers, collective bargaining rights. And I know teachers that when they collectively bargain, they sit down with the school board. Sure, they negotiate for decent wages. They negotiate for health care. They negotiate for a pension. But you know what else they do? They negotiate for class size. I was talking to a teacher at a round table at a church right off Capitol Square a couple of months ago. And she teaches in a Columbus, I believe, suburb. I can't remember where she said. I think she teaches in Hilliard, maybe. I'm not sure. But she talked about in negotiations how they negotiate class size, because she knows no matter what she's paid or no matter what benefits she has, she wants to be a very good teacher. She can't be as good a teacher if there are too many students in the classroom, because she can't give them the kind of individual attention that she chooses to do. Yet, the governor, the legislature, because of this ideological mission they're on, they want to bust teachers' unions. They want to apparently downgrade the respect teachers have in the community. maybe they think they should have become bankers or doctors or lawyers so they can make more money. I don't know why they think that. But what that means is I'm just tired of hearing parents tell me and young people tell me, you know, my daughter or I or whoever was going to be a teacher, and they were studying at Miami University or Ohio University or Toledo or Hiram College, whatever, and they decided when they hear all these politicians, these conservative, mostly Republican politicians in Ohio, Columbus, downgrading teachers and criticizing the profession of teacher, they think, why do I want to do that? I'm not going to make a lot of money. If I'm not going to have any respect from the people that run our state, why do I want to be a teacher, in spite of the fact that they did want to be a teacher? I'm also hearing from young teachers who are now in the classroom waging these fights. It's not easy teaching kids that don't have much advantage. It's not easy teaching kids that are discipline problems. It's not easy teaching kids whose parents are not particularly engaged for reasons of dysfunctional families or income or all the reasons that parents aren't as involved as we'd like them to be. It's hard enough to do that without a bunch of Republican conservative politicians criticizing the profession and saying they quit at 3 o'clock, they don't work in the summers, they're lazy, whatever they say about it. So, Madam President, I wanted to do this today to just talk about teachers that affected my life. Most of these teachers I mentioned teach people in my office. We walked around the office and said, tell me about some teachers. Almost every one of these teachers was somebody who has helped to produce stars, absolute stars in my office. And that's one reason I wanted to share their story. And I wanted to share their story because I think most of us that are fair-minded, unless we're elected to legislatures and right-wing politicians, most of us care about education, and most of us care about teachers. Most of us appreciate what teachers gave to us. Most of us honor them and respect them. But you're not honoring and respecting teachers. You're not honoring and respecting perhaps the most important profession in this country when you take away their rights, when you downgrade them, when you go after their unions in the name of some ideological mission that you're on. It's tragic, Madam President, and I'm sorry. I apologize on behalf. I apologize for them and their behavior to the teachers of Ohio and teachers around the country. It's too important a profession to do that. Madam President, I yield the floor. The absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll. Mr. Akaka.